who happens to be in England right now, and he taught me how to get into Chrome.
Oh,
So I'm here.
How did you meet your guru computer guy?
I've never met him, but
did you
he's
connect?
Well, somebody in Maine gave me his name, and he was living in Maine, and he's awesome. Though we've never met, I've seen him on a Zoom thing, and suddenly he's moved to England, where his daughter lives, and I have a sense he may have gotten a divorce or something. But so he just pops in. Yet, I'd say help, and he says, "You got an hour now?"
Oh,
I try to remember the time difference, but
that's great that you've got somebody who's got your technical back.
He's just amazing. However you do it, he appears. I mean, I can hear his voice. He's as if he's running my laptop.
Oh, awesome. That's wonderful.
Oh, it is.
If you're just joining us here, this is not Tech Hour with Mimsy and Heidi, because we wouldn't get very far.
There he is. Look.
Oh my goodness.
But it's Sunday school. And welcome, Scott.
Hi.
Scott.
Yes. It took me a couple of runs after I ran up the stairs from 8 o'clock church, but it took me a couple of runs at the restream to get on the right link. My apologies.
Oh no, we're just getting settled in. So you're right on time.
Well, you're very gracious to.
Well, welcome to my world. It's usually I'm the last one, and then nobody can hear me. So I've had professional help this week in order to.
I predict that this is the week when we have no technical. Just as we are getting to the end of the pandemic and doing more in person, we're going to finally master this technology. That is my prediction.
Okay. Own it.
Good morning to Zeta. I see she's here with us.
Yeah. I think Zeta's been with us every time.
Zeta is faithful and present. Yeah, thanks for the welcome home. It's good to be back. Good to be back. I'm say something interesting to each other while I pull this thing over off the printer.
Oh, say something interesting. So Mimsy and I were just talking 2 minutes ago about pandemic and late pandemic fashion. Like how long are we going to get to, go casual and just say I'm dressed pandemic? How long do you think we're going to be able to do that? Do you think that'll be a permanent thing?
Well, since I have no shoes other than running shoes, I think I'm in it for good.
I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to go back. I mean, I was a stay-at-home mom for a lot of years, and so I'm like, I love a good jeans and t-shirt. That's my uniform. I can dress up for Sundays if needed.
I've been doing the priest thing for 16 years, and sometimes Ardell says she still can't get used to me not leaving the house in Carhartts and shoes and a t-shirt with my nail bags ready to go. So
you have different nail bags now.
Yep, that's right. But I heard, let's see, who did I hear talking about this? Scott Crosby and Meg Crosby were talking about. Scott, a pretty dapper guy, not quite as dapper as Tom, their son, but he was deciding whether or not to wear a tie to church. And Meg told him, honey, I don't know. They might be gone. They might be gone for.
Right.
Data's voting for leggings.
Oh, leggings.
Hey, Thomas. Hey, Terry. Good to see you all.
Do I hear some shuffling somewhere?
Do I.
It's like, are there papers moving around?
I'm here.
I do hear that. I do hear those papers.
Okay, I'll be gentle with my papers.
Well, there it goes again. There's something.
It just happened again.
I wasn't
I hope Robin is listening. Where are we?
Oh, is there a ghost? I have a microphone here, so I'm trying not to do anything rough near it.
I haven't touched a thing. I've just been.
Robin says she hears it but has no idea what it is. Oh, why do I predict these things that,
That's what it was.
Oh, look here. Seersucker will always be appropriate. Oh, yes, of course.
Well said. And of course, seersucker has an actual practical, it's actually comfortable, right? It's not one of these articles of clothing that we make ourselves suffer in order to show people to be looking good and, seriously. Absolutely. Well, it looks like it's about 9. Since we don't have lots and lots of time, thank you all for jumping in. We're just experimenting for the month of June to put a short conversation between the 2 services. Kudos to Heidi for being our fearless organizer and pulling these together. And we're kind of sharing the leadership of these conversations. So y'all on the chat, please drop your comments in there. I'll do a quick introduction of Padraig, and then we'll roll into his sermon. I was going to read the passage as well. I'll have to see how that goes. So Pádraig Tuama, I think those of you on the chat that I can at least see know who Padraig is, but in case someone else is listening in, he is a poet and theologian. He's Irish. You might have guessed that from his name. And he worked for almost a decade as the leader of the Corrie Mila community in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland. I'm learning from Padraig that there are involved just in how one describes that place. He's also a theologian in residence for On Being, which is a long-standing podcast by Krista Tippett on matters of faith or belief or meaning, and just broadly conceived matters of being human. And if you don't know that, I commend it to you highly. It's the kind of place I go, not just to listen to the episodes, but to figure out who she's interested in, because I'd probably be interested in that person as well. And a few weeks ago, Padraig was the first person other than Krista in 20-something years to actually host On Being. So he relinquished for a day, which he said was an interesting experience. He also has a podcast as part of that called Poetry Unbound, which I commend to you, especially if you don't care for poems, because Padraig has a really unique gift of both choosing a poem and then talking about it for maybe 10 minutes, 8 or 10 minutes is the whole podcast. And really bringing meaning out of it that connects with who we are as people and relationships. For Padraig, a poem is never about a cold, academic, stuffy, esoteric conversation. He thinks they have to do with the stuff of life. So I chose Padraig's sermon from this past. We were all given the latitude to choose whatever sermon we wanted. And we could go back further, but I wanted to return to one that he preached just this very year. And I'd like to quickly read the passage from 2 Samuel. It would be better if he read it, but that's not part of my clip. So you'll have this story in your mind as he talks about it. And I'll be reasonably quick, right? This is from 2 Samuel, the 21st chapter. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David inquired of the Lord. The Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not the people of Israel, but the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had tried to wipe them out in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make expiation that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us to put anyone to death in Israel." He said, "What do you say that I should do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord. The king said, I will hand them over. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merib, daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai. Yes. He gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they impaled them on the mountain before the Lord. The 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock for herself from the beginning of harvest until rain fell on them from the heavens. She did not allow the birds of the air to come on the bodies by day or the wild animals by night. When David was told what Rizpah, daughter of Ai, was the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the people of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Beth-Shan, where the Philistines had hung them up on the day that the Philistines killed Saul at Gilboa. He brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, for they gathered the bones of those who'd been impaled. They buried the bones of Saul and of his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of his father Kish. They did all that the king commanded. After that, God heeded the supplications for the land. So, of all the stories in Scripture, Padraig chose that one. And I wonder, before Robin plays his take on it, if the 2 of you have thoughts about encountering these strange and violent stories in the Hebrew Scriptures, whether they've been a stumbling block for you, or if there have been places where you've experienced unexpected grace or meaning.
So when you sent me this question, I was brought back inexplicably to my elementary school years. I went to a school called North Christian School in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and it was it's in the Reformed tradition, and so Scripture and Bible study is a foundational part of that education. And so, but I remember in probably 3rd or 4th grade, we would have these textbooks where we would go through, I remember one on Judges. And if you've got 3rd and 4th graders, you're reading the whole book of Judges and you're answering questions about it. And I don't remember all of, what was going on there, but I'm thinking there's a whole lot happening. That's pretty violent. That is very just some strange stories in there, frankly. But we were marching through those books and filling out all the questions. And so I read a story like this very differently in my adulthood. But it just made me kind of laugh to think of myself at 9 thinking, oh, okay, they impaled them, and then how many did they impale? Fill in the blank, or whatever the question was. It probably wasn't that, but.
Yeah, it does beg the question. It does ask this question of how and whether we tell stories to our children, and how do we couch them, and what do we trust them with, and what should we shield them from? Those are all very valid. Any for you, Mimsy?
Yeah. Recently, I had the honor of preaching at, preaching at a baccalaureate when my granddaughter graduated, and I chose a text from Deuteronomy, which is Moses' farewell address to the people, because he wasn't going with them, and it seemed appropriate. And I later, a week later, the organist choir master who was sitting up in the loft playing the organ called me, and he said, I had to call and tell you that I've never heard a sermon on the Old Testament. I mean, no one ever uses it. He said, his impression is that we just talk about the gospel and sit down. And I thought that was so interesting, because I fortunately had the experience of learning the Old Testament, basically, at least the story parts, with a group of women when I taught Bible study for so long. We went through every single word of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I find it rich in reality of the world and the lessons that someone like Padraig, to segue into the clip, brings from it. I think he was masterful what he did with this text.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful transition, and I think that's right. That we, Robin, you can go ahead and get that ready at whenever you're ready. And that idea that as Christians, unfortunately, there's also implicit a certain what we would call supersessionist. Christians can say that now that we have Christians, we don't need Jews. That's been a dark part of the Christian history, and very actually we are of the same tree. We are grafted onto the same roots, and so. I think we're obliged as Christians to actually return to the Hebrew Scriptures and say, what are these traditional stories for our brothers and sisters, our Jewish Hebrew brothers and sisters, and how do they affect who we are? So I like. It's helpful for you to say that. Okay, we're going to do about 10 minutes here of Padraig.
So news reaches David that Rizpah, who's the widow of the hated King Saul, and possibly she had been taken as one of David's wives after Saul was dead. News reaches him what Rizpah is doing. And it isn't just that David had allowed this desecration to happen. It's also that we realize that David hadn't even rescued the body of Jonathan, a man he'd loved more than he'd loved anyone else in his life, from the hands of his enemies. He hadn't treated the corpse of King Saul, the king he hated, with dignity. But he hadn't even treated his closest friend with dignity. So what was this? Is this whole story some kind of metaphor for trying to face David with the fact that he needed to do his duty to the king he didn't like, but the son of the king who he loved? It's a terrible metaphor if so. But if so, it does show us what toxicity looked like for David, where you don't even treat those you love with love, where your integrity leaves you, and where you collude in atrocity. I don't think lots of us get to that stage. I don't think lots of us have that kind of power where we can cause such devastation with our chaos. But here the writers show that David, as king, they show him as a man who can't cope with his own chaos. And rather than only punishing himself, he becomes complicit in spreading chaos all around him through the throne of his power. And Rizpah's actions change him. David sees in Rizpah that she lives in honor amidst all the wreck of the dishonor that his dishonor has done. David goes and gets the bones of Saul, the king he didn't like, and Jonathan, the son of Saul, whom he loved, and the remains of Saul and Jonathan, as well as the remains of the 7 men whose murder he's been complicit in, and he buries them. It took all of this to bring David to honor. And I think this is the strange message of this text. It's saying that what happened for David, he didn't grieve, he turned poisonous, and the earth stopped giving in order to get his attention. In a way, he's like Demeter lamenting for Persephone. The earth goes dead. But he's definitely not like her, because he is colluding with murders all along. The Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone implies that the earth goes into mourning with the mourning of Demeter because her daughter has to go into the underworld for 6 months a year, down to Hades, with Hades. But the Hebrew narrative here shows that wars happen when leaders can't pay attention to their own chaos, when they are caught up in the destructive power of listening to their own envy without wisdom, and that wars are played out on the bodies of people they hate and on the families of the people they hate. So this, in a certain sense, is a message to people who carry power. Pay attention to your private chaos, the text is saying, because death has been committed by people who won't face their failures. And so much of the narratives of 1st and 2nd Samuel paint the picture of who is David. I gave that kind of list of some names that I'd give to David at the start. And it's a question throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel that's narrated in sometimes confusing parallel narratives. Sometimes he's an innocent with a harp, and then the next chapter he's wrestling wolves or lions or tigers, or sometimes he's loyal to Saul, and other times it looks like he's always been plotting to dethrone him. And one of the questions that we're often brought with is, how would you narrate this story of David? And again, quoting from the work of Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, she says that if you think of the family of Saul and think about how they would have narrated the story of the impact of David, the man after God's heart, on their lives, you could look at it through these stories. You know, one of Saul's daughter had a broken engagement with David. The other had a broken marriage with him. The son had an intimate relationship with him and died in a war started by these kings. And then Saul, the focus of all this male energy and envy, seems to go mad before he dies in the same war as Jonathan. And then one of the daughters of Saul has 5 sons who were murdered by David in some kind of blood revenge. And the second wife of David has 2 sons murdered by David, some kind of blood revenge as well. So how would they tell the story of the life of the king who was the man after God's heart? Was David hunting God's heart? What would he have done with the heart of God if he'd caught it? I do hope that David was after God's heart, because he needed it. He needed a new one. And I think this is what Rizpah did for him and to him, not as an act of charity or pity, but one of defiance, I think. She showed him what leadership looks like, what it looks like, what it is, what it costs. Rizpah was many things, a grieving mother and a victim of awful abuse of power. She was the subject of a king turned tyrant. She was an agitator for change, a demonstrator of revolution, and she was a challenge in the face of cowardice. Rizpah's name is a blessing, and it is also a call to substantive and systemic change, a revolution, a volta, a turn. As I think of Rizpah, I think about who is Rizpah today, and the answer is many. The person that has come to mind most is Aisha Evans, the woman who travelled to Louisiana in 2016 to protest the shooting by police of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And while taking part in the protest in Baton Rouge, Aisha Evans was photographed standing in the middle of the road in a poise filled with power and challenge and call for justice and revolution. And she was being filmed, she was photographed standing like that just as she was about to be arrested by 3 armed guards who were rushing towards her. It became a very famous photograph. So she was standing, a black woman, arms in front of her, wearing sandals and a light summer dress, and the guards were rushing towards her, wearing armaments and protective gear. She was arrested and subject to humiliations. And that year, 2016, in an article in The Guardian, Aisha Evans wrote, "When the armoured officers rushed at me, I had no fear. I wasn't afraid. I was just wondering, how do these people sleep at night? They put me in a van and drove me away." This is her still writing. Only hours later, did someone explain to me that I was arrested for obstructing a highway. In that same article in The Guardian, she goes on to write, "I have a 6-year-old son, Justin, and I fear more for his life than I do for my own. How should I raise him? To be afraid? To keep his head down and not get in trouble? To not look the police in the eye because they might mess with him? Or do I raise him in strength, to embrace his colour, to know his rights, and to know that he's not breaking the law or doing anything unjust, that he's going to be fine, and that no one should take away any of his civil liberties?" Still writing, she writes, "Parents have a responsibility to wake the hell up and realise what's going on." She told her son Justin that she'd gotten arrested, even though at the time that she was writing that article in The Guardian, she says that he hadn't seen the picture. And he had said to her, "Why, I thought only bad people get arrested." And she says she was stumped for a bit, and then she said to him, "You know what? That's not always the case." Educator. Aisha Evans writes about systemic racism, and she's critical of the Clinton and Obama administrations as setting the ground for some of the laws about what happened during the Trump administration. Tracy K. Smith, who was then Poet Laureate of the US, wrote about Aisha Evans in her book Wade in the Water, a poetry book, which was published by Grey Wolf in 2018. And here's the poem called Unrest in Baton Rouge. Our bodies run with ink-dark blood. Blood pools in the pavement's seams. Is it strange to say love is a language few practice, but all, or near all, speak? Even the men in black armour, the ones jangling handcuffs and keys. What else are they so buffered against, if not love's blade sizing up the heart's familiar meat? We watch and grieve. We sleep, stir, eat. Love, the heart sliced open, gutted, clean, love, naked almost in the everlasting street, skirt lifted by a different kind of breeze. 2 years after she wrote that article in The Guardian, so in 2018, Aisha Evans writes in the HuffPost, and she comments about how some folks had, at the initial outset, wanted to see her as someone who fit particularly into the image about what a peaceful protester looks like, and asked about how she thinks she'll be remembered. She says, "I think I'll be remembered as a peaceful protester who saw injustice going on and took a stand." And then she says this, "I'd like to be remembered as a revolutionary." And her name is Aisha Evans, and she is a blessing. She continues to issue calls for systemic change, for revolution, a volta, a turn. Aisha Evans, and this character of Rizpah coming to us through this text, both saying to leaders, look at what courage looks
Oh. Oh. There were a couple more seconds. But he ends saying, look what courage looks like. Look what leadership looks like. Change. As I recall, he ends with this that her presence, change. Well, so to you two, first, continuing the conversation, maybe starting with this character of David. Maybe some of us didn't remember Rizpah, but most of us would remember David. Did the story and Padraig's treatment of it open up anything to you in the character of David as you remember him or as you assemble him? Complicated biblical character.
I think David's kind of tough for me because I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Is everybody okay? Okay.
Yes, I was blank for a while. I didn't hear anything.
Oh, did you not hear Padraig?
I heard Padraig up to the end, and then all of a sudden it just went blank.
All right.
Sorry, I'm back.
That's all right. I was just going to talk about David, how I think he's complicated. And as an introvert myself who, likes, quiet things, David is definitely a man who seems to learn in public. He does these great big things, and some of them are wrong and some of them are great, and it's just all out there. And I kind of find that hard to relate to. But I did like how Padraig mentioned the interpretation of David being a man after God's own heart, and after as an active verb rather than in the sense of patterned after, which is how I always was taught and thought of that. Like here, God is the model, and David is the manifestation of God's heart in a person. And I think it really helps me to think of David as seeking and learning and, doing all of his loud things in public if he's, at least going for it.
Yeah. What about you, Mimsy? Did this open up anything in David for you?
Yes, it certainly did. I had, in my saga of teaching, we spent a lot of time about David. And I ran across a book that is one of my favorites. It's called Good Book. I'll tell you, anybody who wants to know about it later, in which this man has never read his own scripture. He's Jewish, and he reads the whole thing and writes this book. And he calls David the Bible's Bill Clinton. There were further things that we explored, and one of them was Walter Brueggemann. And I looked up in preparation for today what he had to say in his book, Out of Interpretation. And he says, he thinks that chapter 21, the last couple of chapters, particularly this one, were written with a completely different perspective on David, and one that is not complimentary, that it was to correct some of the warmth, and in spite of the atrocities and adulteries and so forth, that there was a ruthlessness, and many of the things that Padraig mentions for us. It was profound to me, and we talked about that in Bible study a lot. The Bathsheba thing, that I think to make a movie of a murderer and a person who unspeakable, and then to blame God for, to say God punished him. The whole theology is strange. But here is what Brueggemann says. This passage that Padraig chose magnificently, I think, it was an ironic twist to end the whole story of David, that he was not. The thing that puzzles me throughout is it doesn't just say David was a man after God's own heart. It was, and God loved David, and that's repeatedly in there, which may be what the message is most supposed to be, which is in spite of everything, God loved David, not because he was such a romantic hero and so forth, because he was a real flawed person.
I think we can call him a mess, and I think that would be accurate.
I think it's a lot deeper than a mess.
He's a mess. And two things. One, years and years ago, I read The Source by James Michener. I didn't read many of those doorstops that mentioned those long historical fictions that would go back over millennia.
Yeah.
And that was about Israel. And I do vividly remember the character of David, that it was convincing to me, because Michener had this artist, this poet, this deep feeler who could also fly off in this other direction and be destructive. And it was like in the way that the best parts of ourselves can be the source of great damage. A favorite movie of mine is called The Apostle. That's Robert Duvall movie about a Pentecostal preacher, and Ardell grew up in Pentecostal traditions, and he is a deeply complex person who can both be and violent, and also does want to kind of be transparent, to bring down the inhibitions that keep us from being ourselves before God. He wants to know God, and something in the horror and the complexity of David, the strong language keeps pushing us to say, and God loved David. To keep us in that complex place is powerful to me.
Here's the thing that gets me. I actually did a whole class for Holy Communion one time on what is it about David, because why is Jesus called the Son of David?
Yeah.
I mean, he is genealogically, You can prove that. But it's a very, here comes son of David, son of David. No wonder they expected a warrior king.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to talk about, so let's move on to Rizpah. Because the things we get to see through is this minor character that Padraig really holds up. Talk to me about Rizpah and how Padraig thinks that this is a story about. Well, what does he think? I won't put words in your mouth. What does Rizpah add to the saga?
I think it's courage, determination, and really more courage, more audacity.
Yeah, she had no place. She was not in a position of formal power to make any claims.
I think he used the word honor too. And what did it mean to honor loved ones that David didn't do for Jonathan, but that Rizpah did do for her family? And it was such I thought it was kind of a brilliant confrontation. There were no words exchanged that we know of. Right. It was just being there and keeping the birds away and just staying there.
Well,
that demonstrated her honor and conviction.
Yeah. I think it's one of the most powerful stories. I would venture to say, does anybody who's listening or watching us, has you ever heard the story of Rizpah? I mean, that's the brilliance to me of this Old Testament. Because
go ahead. So what she does, as you're saying, Heidi, is that she these actions, all they do is leave David with his toxicity, his collusion in the murder of his friend, all of the things that are actually part of himself. She has this way of stepping into this, and he is left with himself. She doesn't explain it. She doesn't argue it. It definitely reminds me of the direct action campaigns of different folks in the civil rights era that were meant to say this stuff that's going on all the time. We're going to stand here and bear witness to it, and we're going to make it hard to ignore. Once you see on the television the dogs and the fire hoses and whatnot.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. The image, we're very much an image-driven culture right now.
Yes.
And I thought that, the photograph of Aisha Evans was so powerful, whereas, the articles, that's good to explain and good to have some background or context or additional meaning. But the image is so arresting just on its own. Kind of,
yeah.
Beyond words. There's a lot there.
Robin, I didn't hear back if you were able to get share that image or not. I don't know if the folks who...
She did. Oh, I don't know. Maybe not.
Are we still hearable? Oh, there we go. I think we can't do two. Oh, we can do two things at once, but I'm too big. I just wanted folks to see that image. Robin, just put it up for 5. There. Just wanted folks to have that image in front of them in case they hadn't seen it, to ask how that particular image made this connection for Padraig, and get your thoughts on that. Does this seem to you like a valid, we always take care to say, are we being engaged in our world, or are we being partisan? Does this feel like a faithful move for Padraig to make this connection?
I didn't hear the question, Scott. Could you?
Yeah. Does it seem? Do you see the connection between the two as Padraig brought it to us? Is the question. I think it's I mean, the situations are a little bit different,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you know, honoring the dead, I think, is a similar theme, and you know, just sort of a bodily presence as protest is also similar with Rizpah.
Mhm.
I
Good.
thought just in the image, and you know, it's just captured one very tiny instant, but the people who are, well, I don't even know what to call them. Are they police or are they different than that? But they look almost like insects. They are covered, every piece of them, with armament, and her gaze is over and above all of it. You know, she said she didn't feel fear in that moment. She sort of felt just kind of there, and I see that in her expression there. But then the man who is approaching her on the left, maybe, it looks like he is trying to connect with her, and I think there's so many layers of story there. You know, what is he being called to do? Does he want to do it? What is she being called to do? Does she want to be there? Yeah, this photograph is, I could spend an hour with it, just the image.
Yeah.
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 I did a little backstory. I mean, looking into her, and maybe you all did too. There's a clip on YouTube about her, and she says that there were 2 other murders of Black men in New York, and that she didn't. One was Eric Garner, one was Philandro Castro, I think, and she said she didn't go to the protests. That she used the excuse that she had to work, which she did as a single mom. And she said, so she was actually looking for a protest when this murder occurred, and took herself down there. And that from then on, she never missed a demonstration. But she wanted to, I thought that was so powerful that she admitted that she had stayed home and felt ill about it practically until something else happened.
Yeah. Thomas has the question image. I don't know if you're asking to see it again or if you're just noting that just the image itself, in the story of Rizpah, it's very much, there's this image of vulnerability and yet this strength in the face of it's clear where all the power lies in both stories, right? She's sitting there on Rizpah is here in front of the bodies of these who've been slain, with no protection. She's waving away these the animals and whatnot. Similar, I think the dress, the contrast just visually in where the power lies. Yeah. Yeah.
But you can at least see the little tiny figures there.
Yep. So it really does, and please, y'all put your questions in the chat. I'm sorry, if you've got some, we will stop and take them on. But it really does. One of the things Padraig says is it presses on all of us. What will you do with your chaos?
Yeah.
The chaos in us, especially if we have particular power in the culture, in the world, your chaos can do great damage in the world.
Yes.
And who are the people who can mirror it back to us?
I was going to say, I mean, chaos can be outward, and chaos can also destroy us inwardly as well.
Yeah, and inward chaos often also makes its way out, even when we don't think so. Hope, yes. Let's see. Aisha spells her name very strangely.
Yeah. Actually, it's very phonetic. Iesha. Iesha, I believe.
Yes. Yes. Sorry, I misspelled it in my notes, so I'd be just telling you. Say that again.
Me? It's I, capital IESHA.
Evans.
Evans.
That's what it is, Hope.
If you just Google that, Hope.
Yeah.
And not Google, but go on YouTube and get it. Yeah.
So it's, again, in an image, we don't know all of the backstories, and I love that y'all have fleshed out some of this, but it's also in scripture. I feel like there's this way of presenting us with an image. So there's one thing in interpreting scriptural stories. We talk about not trying to get behind the text. So in a sense, accepting the images we have received from this story and asking, I wonder what God is challenging me with. Because the community has passed these stories down. So in one sense, it's not even a matter of, I just need to figure out whether David was actually a good guy or got a bad telling or a good shake. Like, I mean, that's good work to do as a scholar, but as people of faith, we take these stories as they are because we're trusting that the tradition and our forebears have handed them down because there's something for us in them. And I feel like that image is something like that. I truly believe that the officers in that are much more complex than I'm inclined to make them, or than the situation will make them. We need to always bear this in mind.
That's a great point.
Bear this in mind, but also accept the power when there's this image of a great, great contrast in, no, this really is a world where some people are exposed to the power of the world, completely vulnerable to it, and others hold it. And if we don't acknowledge that, we, like David, can do great damage, thinking we're just living out who we are, living into the role we think we've been assigned. So I think I'm preaching this morning on story and the idea that Jesus actually, Mark says, he taught only in parables.
Yeah.
He only did parables, only stories. He didn't instruct people on morals, and he didn't do, it wasn't philosophy. And the image like this, I feel like what Padraig is so gifted at is drawing us into the energy and the genius of a story.
Yes.
That we can make a connection with across all these centuries.
What story would David tell about this story? I wonder. What parable would he?
I wonder. The last thing I have to say with 3 minutes left is that this is also a story it's quite beautiful if we can step back from our need to figure out what was literally true. It's quite beautiful that the earth stopped producing in the face of this violence. And that at the end, there was something that the earth itself yielded up to fruitfulness again. Which, less than I wonder why droughts happen, feels like it pulls all of creation into the human story, into the divine story, like Jonah does in other places. Mm-hmm. Were you struck by that?
Yeah.
That's enough. I mean, I do, but if you had you're welcome.
I think we spend so much time on the human elements of stories, but our bodies are nature, and nature affects us. We get wet when it rains, and we're changing the temperatures of the earth by burning things and sending up carbon dioxide. So I think, maybe, the direct correlation, I didn't act this way one time and the whole drought happened, but is not where we need to go. But
right.
Certainly we are absolutely connected to God and to the created world in so many ways that I really appreciate you bringing that up. I tend to live in my head and then live in the people world, and not always enough in the.
I would just say, Scott, look around. Look at the statistics, but look around. Yes, the earth is telling us something now.
Yeah, to use Padraig's words again for David, you must deal with your chaos, or your chaos will spill out into the world around you. And this story actually involves creation itself in the chaos of David's violence. And then in the end, in this moment of resurrection, in a way, the earth is coming back into fruitfulness when some truthfulness. It doesn't undo the horror, but if there's not a way forward after horror, there's not a way forward, right? That's resurrection. That's that there's hope that we can go forward in God and make the world anew, you know. Well, it's 9:45. This was delightful. Love conversing with you too. Love that you all were pitching in. Thank you, Hope. Thank you for joining this conversation. Hope and Zeta and Thomas and Linda Gale and Madge and all the rest. Really enjoyed it. We wish we had a way to do both at once, like where we could have some people in the room, and we're kind of working on if we can do that. But, you know, this is COVID time. It's hard to make this available to people who are coming to church, but maybe some more people will watch it afterwards.
All right.
Thanks to you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Godspeed.
Bye.